Well, welcome to Voices with Vervaeke. I'm joined by a good friend of mine, Taylor Barratt. And Taylor actually facilitates the circling group that I attend. He's one of the two facilitators, he and his wife, Joanna. And so Taylor's also doing some really interesting work around circling, authentic relating, and also he's in an interesting way, he's taken up the call of trying to bring a little bit more of, if you'll allow me a term, philosophia into circling. And what does that look like? And so I'm just going to turn it over to Taylor to introduce himself and talk a little about where he's coming from and what he's seeking for.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, so I think I've been working in authentic relating for the last 7 years. Was not something I was looking for. My wife had found it, and we weren't married at the time. We had only been dating for like 2 weeks, and so she sort of said like, "Hey, you want to try this thing?" And I was just in a position where I was really open to new things. So I did this thing, and I had no idea, like the end result of it is I had no idea that I needed this. I had no concept of what was possible. Like I had never done any therapy. I had never done any sort of group process work. Like I was just very much in automatic mode with my life. And it was amazing. After our first event, we spent hours sort of debriefing it and immediately changed our language, changed the way we were relating to each other. And we just started burning through, like our stuff, like our material, just getting more intimate and more, close, and like getting down to the heart of the real truth of what was underneath, all our behaviors, all our surface behaviors.
Right.
So, I mean, the magic of that experience of sort of being on this rocket ship together had us like do all the events, and then there were trainings being offered. So we took the trainings, just really so believing in what this could do for us. So, yeah, we took over the Toronto community about 4.5, 5 years ago and started building it out. Adding more events and more facilitators and training them. So that's sort of how that's been going. But I mean, all this work, this authentic relating work really falls under sort of an umbrella of relational leadership, or maybe more accurately, relational self-leadership. Like how do we bring ourselves and how do we take responsibility for ourselves in relationship with other people? And the frame for this is around authenticity. And the way we hold authenticity is it's more where our outward expression more accurately reflects our inner experience. And this is a little bit different than, say, like a radical honesty practice where you just share everything that comes in your mind. Here, this is sort of in service of something. So, for example, if I was upset with you and I decided you were some expletive name, in radical honesty, I might just say that thing, with all the vigor. In authentic relating, I also might say that thing, but probably more accurately is just like, like, oh, I noticed I'm like feeling really angry with you, and then when we get really good at it, we might notice the thing that's underneath it, like, and that's because I'm feeling a bit hurt about that thing that you said, so we start to sort of own our experience, not make you responsible for it, make other people responsible for it. We sort of like take it back and sort of own it. It's almost like a subtle shadow integration, that motion of sort of taking it back and re-identifying.
Right.
Yeah. So that's sort of the, the basis for me, or the way I hold authentic relating. And it can be sort of looked at as a way of being, like a way to be in the world, through this relational self-leadership. But then there's things that are known as authentic relating practice, which you've experienced, sort of the warm-ups that we do, the exercises. Yeah, and we sort of liken those to like going to the emotional workout gym, So when you go to the normal gym, you go do squats over here and you go do a leg press over there and you do biceps here. In an authentic relating practice, we might work on our empathy, we might work on our listening skills, we might work on noticing, like bringing language to our emotions. So that's sort of authentic relating practice. And then circling, which I know you're familiar with, but it's this, we call it an intersubjective meditation practice. It's like a group practice, and there's different formats of it and slight variations to it. But this also I consider this falling under authentic relating practice. To me, it's like the marathon. We go to the gym so that we can run the marathon, and to me, circling is sort of the main event.
Right.
Yeah. So so that's what I've been up to for the last 7 years. And then I noticed about 6 months ago or so, after watching a number of your episodes of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and some of the stuff that Peter was doing, like, he was really like shaking up sort of containers. Yeah, Peter Lindbergh, yeah, like some sort of shaking up containers and sort of like clashing, like different groups and sects. And I just noticed, like, through that, I think he had started talking with maybe Jordan Hall at that time, and Guy Sengstock, and I noticed Rebel Wisdom was starting to talk with and I'm watching these videos, and I'm like, I'm starting to get this sense, like, oh yeah, there's something here. Like, we were sort of like 6 months ago, it seemed like we were sort of teasing around the emergence of some idea, of something that to me was a bit transcendent of circling. Right. I still love circling. I'm still going to do circling. I'm still going to train circling. I think it's critical. And the intention that we bring in circling to really like be with you in your world, as beautiful as it is, as transformative of a practice as it can be, it also has some limitations. And by trade, I'm a problem solver. Before I got into this, I wrote software. I'm a software engineer. Right. So my brain actually works really well for, solving problems. And then you're bringing in this frame of sense making while I'm like feeling really integrated with the circle. I'm like, oh, what can we do with this? Right. At the same time I'm thinking about this, I'm like sitting in one of your Q&As, and you say, oh, what if we take circling, like drop a problem into it? Okay, we're talking about very similar things here. So that's when I had contacted you and said, like, hey, I'm starting to think about, running a project to try to blend the first, second, and third person perspectives into a more whole discussion. Right. Because in my sense with circling, we focus primarily on the I and the we. Very first and second person. We don't talk about a lot of content there. I've known people in this community for 5 years. I have no idea what they do for a job. Like that's not the way that we actually interact. But when it comes to like the world's problems, I'm like I just see problems everywhere. That's just my orientation. It's a bit of a pain, but it's a bit of a torment too. So, pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, the biggest pain that I was experiencing in my circles is sort of like ideological possession and polarities, between like that are happening in society, and just this clashing. And it's just like, wow, why can't, this sucks. This is just so uncomfortable and terrible. And I can, from one side, see it as like a necessarily developmental stage for people to go through, for society to go through. And it's like, surely we can do this better. So that was sort of the fire that had sort of lit me up in sort of experimenting with trying to find a different way to have a conversation around polarities. What's since happened since the pandemic has come is somehow that didn't feel so salient anymore. I was like, okay, I mean, that's still out there, but I want to have a different kind of conversation. Now I want to have much more of a collective intelligence style of conversation. And that's been the last few rounds of the experiment have really been not so much about the way in which we are same, but trying to bring our relationship to the pandemic into coherence, in the hopes that it might start to reveal some really strong insight or even internal motivation to turn around and start moving into action. So that's sort of been the trajectory of it for me.
So there's a lot there. Wow, that was great. No, 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 no. Don't apologize. That's why I didn't interrupt. It was unfolding really, really with very smooth intelligibility. Um, so um, that obviously means that there's some ways in which, I mean, you've put your finger on a couple points, but I want you to go back and just unpack, if you would, please, a little bit more about, why is circling inadequate for the things you're pursuing here.
Mm.
I of course, the caveat, the acknowledgement, you love circling, it's part of your way of life. I get that. That's not what I'm asking. I'm not, I'm asking you for critique, not just criticism.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I think my perception of circling, although I might practice circling a little bit different than I've always had a bit of an allowance, but there's a tendency within circling of this sort of intention to go really inward.
Yep.
Into the subjective, and to explore the subjective. While I think our subjective relationship to whatever the third person problem is, per se, is extremely important, we don't tend to actually look at the problem. The problem tends to be something like, oh, I'm really hard on myself, or I feel a lot of fear about being alone during the pandemic, right?
Yep.
And that, might be, an exploration of, well, what does that fear work? Where does it live in your body? What does that feel like? All very helpful and important explorations.
Right.
But I think you sort of said something about this before too. It's sort of like, okay, but now what do you do with that? Like where do you go from there? So I think it affords great personal insight, and I see it as a fantastic personal growth tool. But as I consider this sort of this shift out, or I've been seeing it as a bit more of a, I think you would call it an anagogic, sort of rise, is that that's still there. We still have some degree of insight into our subjective, but it also seems to bring something forward into the space that then others can sort of play with to a certain extent, and then form their relationships to it, and we can sometimes do that in circling, but again, it comes right back to the individual and the I and the subjective, like, oh, it's a little bit different for me. And again, very important distinctions, but we just tend to devalue the thing. We don't come in with a problem. We might talk about how we relate to the problem, but it doesn't afford much wisdom. Self-wisdom, sure, but like collective wisdom, it's less certain.
Yeah, so there's a way in which, if see if this resonates, that circling sort of really activates, actualizes, collective intelligence, and even puts it into this, dynamic flow. And people do note that. They note that, we often get into, two people will resonate and they'll do that subjective exploration, facilitating each other. But we've noted in circling that, but there's ways in which the circle sort of weaves these things together and can sometimes disclose something beyond the individual, right?
Totally.
And so, and I remember there was one thing we did where it was actually an interaction that you and I had at the end of a circling, where the shift in the locus of intimacy was off you and I being intimate with each other. That wasn't abandoned, but that was backgrounded, and that platformed an intimacy with the process of intelligibility itself, with the sense-making process itself. And so, and that to me was a bit of a felt shift. And so there's a possibility that once we activate it and actualize it, we could couple to it. We could like sail on the wave of intimacy, if you'll allow me some metaphors here, Jordan Hall's metaphor, right? With a kind of direction and orientation, like, so that, like you said, we could drop a problem in, or we can drop a mystery in, like and again, not to foreclose that we're looking for an answer. I think of it more as, could we activate collective intelligence and shape it into collective wisdom so that we get into right relationship with reality and the problem. Just like circling brings us into right relationship with each other. People are invoking that language a lot. I feel so connected, and it's so good, and it's so right, right?
Totally.
It hasn't finished our relationship. We don't go, well, you know, Taylor, that was it. That now we're done, right?
Yeah.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So instead, we're coming into right relationship, but we can. There are things, and I'm using this term as neutrally as possible. There are things we have to come into right relationship other than with ourselves and just each other. We have to come into right relationship with ways of being, with patterns in our culture, with the unfolding of reality itself. And the COVID crisis makes that deeply apparent to us. Does that land with you? Or
Oh yeah, totally. I almost see it as like the circling part of the process that you and I are exploring, like sets us up not so much to achieve this end goal, but it sets us up in such a way in which it's possible that something could actually manifest.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
it's almost like without that intimacy, you know, there isn't a trust. I might not be willing to try out a new idea or, you know, bounce that off because, you know, oh, maybe normally I don't know who you are and maybe you're going to judge me. But here it's like, oh, we're in a relationship and we're getting each other and we're reciprocally sort of building this thing that then it affords a lot more trust, and therefore I think freedom of exploration is probably the way I would look at it. Mm-hmm.
So that then, so sort of a two-part question, and let me give some contextualization for it. You know, I've been doing stuff with, and you mentioned it, with Guy and Chris, you know, Guy Senstock, Chris Mastropietro, Jordan Hall, and other people about, you know, trying to bring philosophia into circling. The guy calls it circling 2.0, but people are now sort of adopting the term that Chris and I have, the dialogos, because we're also hearkening back to sort of the Socratic Platonic template of these kinds of open-ended discussions, right? And that in which people are they're accessing collective intelligence, but they're trying to participate it such that it is turned towards getting into deeper and more comprehensive right relationships to being, to others, to important social ideals like justice. And so the two-part question is, what is it specifically you're trying to do in your experiment? So lay it out and the progression. What are you finding? What have you learned? I mean, a good experiment should always challenge you. It should be, well, some of the predictions came. It's a good experiment if you say some of the predictions came true and some of them didn't, and the ones that didn't give me a better way of interpreting the ones that did. So that, and then, so what you're doing, and then how, because you know I've talked about it. How is it convergent with, and how can it be put into conversation? Sorry for the pun. With the sort of the dialectic-dialogos project that I've been involved in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that okay as a question, or was that too much?
I think I get it.
Okay.
So correct me if I go off into the weeds or something here.
Okay.
So yeah, the first couple of rounds around it, I had like this focus on people taking a side and putting 4 people into a conversation, a facilitated conversation. And then I had people on the outside observing that conversation. And there were a few reasons for doing that, but I wanted some people just in an observational third-person role to create a bit of an arm's length distance to when we started actually talking about the content. And what I found in that was rather, I mean, there could be a few reasons of why it sort of worked and sort of didn't work. So we picked a topic, and this topic was about the change of lyrics around the Baby It's Cold Outside around Christmas time, because it was about right for the time. And there were people who said like, that was ridiculous, I shouldn't have changed the lyrics. And people like, we tried to pick something a little on the safe end just to try out the structure first.
Right.
And you know, what happened was, you know, for me as a facilitator, I started off in the third person and just sort of like checking in with everybody to see what their position was and get shared reality about that position. fortunately, what happened is the people in the conversation actually found their own points of meeting and started to come a little bit more into an I or we around this idea.
Right, right,
So we could sense the potential, but something about it didn't feel as intimate or say as potent as say if we circled around it,
right,
like if we
right, right,
really
right,
went
right.
with a circling intention. And then the next time I did it, we really struggled again. Like it was something about, maybe it was the sample group, taking people who are familiar with owning their experiences and,
Yeah,
really not projecting and being able to see complexity and not actually really take a full on, hard stance on a particular
yeah,
position. That seemed to be really difficult just to tease out the polarity to even do the experiment. So in some ways, with that a bit fizzled, it made it really sort of this wonky discussion of like, well, how are we gonna like come to some meeting point of understanding somewhere in the middle of shared reality around these issues? It just wasn't really happening.
right,
Um, so then I tried a couple more rounds, but this was now into the pandemic, and
right,
I was noticing the way people were relating to this particular issue. I was trying to have other discussions about the pandemic, and I noticed every time I would try to talk about the it of the pandemic, it was so hard to come into any kind of coherence because everybody had their unique personal
right,
impact of how they were being impacted by the pandemic. And
right,
it was only until we could actually address and have them bring their voices forward and feel heard and seen in how they're impacted did they seem open or even capable of starting to take in some of the objective
right, right.
aspects of it. So that was like, okay, I definitely need to come with, with the first person perspective first. So that was very important to sort of learn. But even in that particular one, there were a number of gaps in capacity in terms of relational capacity. So there was actually some pretty big gaps in how people were relating to each other. And then to have like 6 people in about an hour and like to try to get everybody to sort of meet, and it
Yeah,
just wasn't working. So it further revealed to me how important capacity is, or at least some sort of pedagogical lead up to it,
yeah,
like
yeah,
context
yeah,
setting, in terms of actually being able to do this really well. So, you had mentioned that one
yeah,
situation with you and I at the end of circling, where we said like, oh, let's experiment with this. And when you feel like we're at the point, let's zoom out and
yeah,
then zoom in and
yeah,
zoom out,
yeah, yeah,
and I think that worked so easily because of one, you and I already had whatever the relationship was. There was already that
yeah,
intimacy.
yeah, yeah,
We already started encircling, but then there's a certain capacity of me to like I don't have any belonging needs with you or with the
yeah,
group. I'm
yeah,
not afraid that you're going to judge me. I don't have this other thread that I have to. So it allows me to open up and surrender to
right, right, right,
the symbolism that was happening in that particular exploration.
right.
So I'm noticing these bits and pieces of what are the ingredients
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
for success, and how does even, I hold a large developmental lens when I'm working with people, and it's like, where, like, what can we reasonably expect, or how can we configure this such that it's more accessible. Like I watch you and Guy and Jordan do a dialogos conversation, and it's like, yeah, like that makes sense. I would not be able to have had that
yeah,
conversation
yeah, yeah,
with the mix group that I have, and there's various reasons for that. So it's starting to sort of notice like, how can we bring this this relational leadership style of conversation in which we can actually work on a problem in a way that's accessible to people, that provides like a leg up towards, I think, more
yeah,
of
yeah.
a dialogos conversation.
Right, right.
Yeah. So that's kind of what I've been noticing in a real general sense, and trying to move towards that. So I'm imagining future ones might be, I might start to pick out a specific invite group and set a specific type of context for people who I think could really open their perspectives in a very philosophical sort of or theoretical perspective,
Right.
and then see what happens from that, using the same tools, I would say, or the same intention of, let's connect, let's solve whatever interpersonal thing to get the flow going, And then let's notice where are the moments where we have, it's the word salience, or sort of a cohesion around something. And then it's like, okay, now we can pop out, and now we can start to sense make on it.
Yeah. So I'm trying to reverse engineer that too. I've sent you some documents around that. So so there's that, and that's and it's very much a work in progress. So a couple things come to mind. One is, Peter and I are talking about this, sort of a progressive program of pedagogy. Like maybe you start with just, social noting, and then perhaps move into something like empathy circling. Because Edwin argues it's a great gateway practice, right? For moving people from adversarial winner take all into, wait, we can actually make stuff together. We can get into right relationship with each other, and that's much more important than having the right view, right relationship, right? Totally. And then maybe taking it into circling. And then I've been trying, I said, what would you do to, like you said, to notice the moments where people are sensing the hand of the logos, and get that zoom in, zoom out thing happening.
Yeah.
So I think part of what I'm saying is, and you did bring up pedagogy. It sounds like ways in which we can try and do the bridging and the capacity affordance is if we have that pedagogical program. And it's like when I'm teaching the meditation course, I don't teach people prajna at the beginning. You have this progressive buildup of skills and practices that scaffold people in. So that would be sort of the bottom up. But I also think, and Chris and I are talking about this, and I want to get your feedback on it, that should be complemented with a lot of, sorry, this was, I'm struggling for an adjective here. I want to say it's sort of high level, and that sounds elitist. So I'm trying not to. So high level dialogos that we're and also ask people to, they don't get it, but imitate it. Play with it, pretend, right? Because that's what kids do. That's what kids do until they pretend, until they can comprehend, right? And so the idea of getting a practice where we say, look, we're going to show you this, and obviously not at the beginning, but let's say people are starting to move into this pedagogical programming and say, oh, let's watch some of these. And you're not going to be able to do that. That's fine. And don't worry, but get into serious play. Try to imitate it. Try to imitate it as much as you can. And I'm not holding myself out as something. I'm just saying, imitate the dialogos wherever we can find it. I mean, because that's why Plato wrote the dialogues, right? Initially, we sort of imitate, and I'm saying maybe we could have a simultaneous strategy where we're doing this, pedagogical program where we have sequences of practices that scaffold people in, bridge them in, build their capacity, but also give them a lot of role modeling and right, and say, okay, just imitate this, play, pretend. Play and pretend and imitate, play and pretend and imitate, because this is how kids also, this is how they go through developmental stages. And I'm wondering if we got a pedagogical program of practices, and then we had sort of ritualized imitation, serious play. You go into a church, that's how they scaffold people into Christianity. And I don't mean any insult. You take them through a catechism, you build them up, but you also do a lot of imitating of Christ. You do a lot of imitating of Christ and imitating of Paul, and imitating of Moses. You do all that. You do both of those together. So what do you think about that as a proposal?
Yeah. I mean, what I noticed in the last round when I ran it is there was a moment where I felt like I was in contact with the logos. I'm like, oh, this is the thing. Right, so I brought it forward as an invitation. Nobody took it up. So I waited, and I'm like, they said whatever they wanted to say, and I brought it back in as an invitation, sort of like, oh, what is it about this thing that has like, you want to do this and you want to do this and I want to do this? What is it? And they just didn't seem to quite know what to do with the invitation,
right?
Which, is more on me than on them. But I know at the end of that, I felt like we really got somewhere. Like at the end of it, like everybody was like, no, I really enjoyed that. I want to do this again. Let's do a series of these. And so for me, the thing that I trust the most is like, what was my intention? And then what's the felt experience I have at the end of it? And do I feel like, I'm moving towards that intention, or am I moving away from it? And I think to a certain degree, you know, just having that discussion, even though we didn't, you know, go into some sort of, you know, huge relevance realization
Yeah.
around, you know, why we have a tendency to give the perfect advice to other people, but not take it on
Right,
ourselves.
right, right. Good, good.
You know, which was the piece. I'm like, oh, I want to go into that. Like, let's
Right,
tease that out. But I think just the idea that we can have that conversation and start bringing in that third person was a very different type of conversation that I've ever had with that group of people. And I canvassed them, I asked them, and it was very different than any other conversation that they had too. So it was
right,
almost like we're hinting at the potential the more and more in which we sort of exercise this.
right,
So I think even just sort of the role playing idea or sort of the imitation idea, I think would also serve that in very much the same way. It creates a comfort with the intention and the container of what we're here to do. And maybe I'm not going to quite, you know, I'll need the training wheels and then I'll take the training wheel. I might fall over, but, you know, I get an idea of what it is that we're doing because I've seen somebody ride a bike before. I've
right.
never seen somebody ride a bike before. I might look at the bike and not know what in the heck I'm supposed to do with that.
Exactly. That's a beautiful analogy. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's
So I think that's a great idea, and I appreciate you bringing it forward because it gives me some ideas. It's like, oh, okay, I know what I'm going to do.
well, I mean, and this is also something I guess I'm trying to argue for and exemplify. You know, I keep going back to this template of dialectic and Socrates and Plato, and it keeps being a fount of intelligibility. It keeps giving me because and there's and you actually see it in the dialogues that people like, even the aphoretic dialogues, the dialogues where, you know, they bring up some problem and they don't get a solution, and it looked at argumentatively. It was like, well, that was useless. No, we didn't figure out what, you know, what courage is. But but if you pay attention to the dialogues, what happens is people get educated, right, in a particular way. They stop let's see, they stop following the authority of obviousness. Well, you know, just, wow, it's X, right? Or you know, the authority of, you know, sort of formal definitions. Well, I read that this is it, right? And then what happens, right, is as people get into that, and they instead get into the right relationship with the logos, what you see is the people who, like the people that Socrates was dialoguing with, they'll say things like, well, I want my sons to hang around you.
Mm.
I want my children to hang around you. So although you could, although we didn't come up with a definition of courage, you exemplified it. You exemplified it in a powerful way. You made it sort of beautifully accessible to me. And I want my sons to stay around you because I think if they could imitate you long enough, then they would get, right? So they at least get that inkling you're talking about. And then that inkling gets linked to them to imitation. Now, of course, they're adults, and so they have their egos, and they're not going to imitate. But they want their kids, their sons, and this is very important in ancient Athens. They want their sons to start to imitate Socrates. And so I think there's developmentally that modeling of the relationship between inkling and imitation is actually a very natural one for us.
Yeah, and I think what I'm sort of hoping, I don't know ultimately what we'll end up doing with this conversation, if we just have the conversation or if we find out like, oh, actually, people might actually want to watch this conversation too. And I think that's why I had the observer role too, is I'm still trying to figure out how to bring that back in. I've taken it out, but something about it I know feels right to me. There's something I think really valuable in having people in that third person role.
Yeah.
But my sense is that through, what was I going to say? Through, oh, I'm starting to lose the thread now. What was I going to say?
Well, the last thing I said was sort of inkling into imitation.
Yeah. It was. I know it's still on the thread of imitation. Well, the one thing that I would say is when we train people in circling, before they know how to circle, before we have given them all the tools, and I mean, it's a highly experiential practice. So really your training is not done after we give you, you know, the pedagogy anyways, like
Right,
you
yeah.
have to. they do circling, but at first we won't call it circling. We call it something else so that, you know, the pressure of, I don't know how to do that isn't there, you know, so we bring in an element of circling, and then we start to say, okay, now we're going to do it this way. You're just going to circle me, like, you know, as opposed to, you know, so we start to sort of pad this out and grow it so that there technically always have been circling. But you know, before they have all the knowledge, one may need to hold that structure. So I think that, you know, is already a thing that's in place for at least how I train people in circling. And I'm pretty sure others would too. I don't think, I'm sure everybody's doing training circles. So I think that's very much a part of it, you know, and you get the feedback, which is kind of why I was hoping to use the observational group to actually use this container also as a training tool in of itself, as a teaching tool. So there's the insight that it can afford, and there's also the practice of doing it and not being successful as a teaching tool as well. Yeah.
So I see what you're saying, though. There's a sense in which the people in the third person perspective, maybe this was the connection you were feeling towards. They're going from like you know, participating in the insight and the flow to seeing it as something, and when it works, they are getting something that they may want to imitate. They may want to participate in. Was that part of the intent of that? Of having the group out there?
Well, I certainly have gotten that when we would go to take feedback from the third, everybody would start bringing in their first person subjective sort of opinion about the topic. So you could really see people, you know, who were in the third person role really wanted to be a part of that conversation. So that sort of validates the idea, right? I think this was the thing I was going to say, that maybe we can present this as something that, you know, so you have these fantastic conversations with Jordan Hall. Maybe your conversations with him aren't an accurate analogy here, or a frame. Maybe take like a Rebel Wisdom one where David Fuller's interviewing Jordan Hall or yourself about something. It's this sort of discussion that's sort of in one direction to the expert. You guys do it beautifully, but not everybody's an expert. So how do we bring people into having a conversation like you're saying, like it's not going to be this, but maybe we're imitating, maybe we're starting to build the capacity through actually enacting the practice, such that maybe it doesn't feel like a bridge too far. Oh, well, maybe I'll actually share my opinion this time. Oh, actually, now I'm going to stand for my opinion this time. Oh, actually, I'm going to go do some research on my, you know, like we're giving them an opportunity that maybe they feel like a sort of a me too. I can do that as well, rather than watching, you know, beautiful and really inspiring for me 2-hour conversations, but it's just like they don't have a bridge. Like, how do I get to a place of philosophia? How do I do that? Well, hey, maybe there's a practice here that starts to crank that engine a little bit.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah. So that's what I'm hoping for.
No, that's good. I like that. So the thing that came to mind was a pedagogical model of apprenticeship. Right. And that, and then, and you don't expose the apprentice to the masterwork at the beginning. If you, that's where masterpiece comes from. That's what I, right. You don't expose them to sort of perhaps masterpiece conversations. Well, you don't forbid them, of course, but maybe, like you said, maybe what you need is you need role models that are also sort of timed at critical transition periods within the pedagogical program. So when you're in this one, here's a role model that you can imitate for what to do here. And then when people move, you go, oh, here's a role model for what you do here. And then here's a role model for what you do there. And then you can be doing both the bottom up, you could do the enacting, you could also be doing the imitating, and then you could scaffold people up. And then when they're getting, and then you say, okay, now here, and you present something like that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Does that sound?
And that totally fits with my intention and why I was holding this particular frame for it, rather than, you know, this, you know, philosophia or like, still the logos is available in our conversations, but we're not having a philosophical or a very broad sort of conceptual sort of discussion. but I believe that the thing that we're doing, the motions that we're doing, the zooming in, the zooming out,
Yeah.
the integrating of these three perspectives, those are happening in both of our
Yeah.
explorations.
Yeah. That's good. That's really good.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad I'm recording this because this is going to be very valuable for the work that I'm doing. So
Good.
are you so I guess, are you going to continue the experimentation, or is COVID really putting a dent in trying to keep things going?
No, I'm actually, we've done more, fortunately because of online, it's a little bit, and plus people aren't as busy, I guess.
Yeah.
So there are, people are a little bit more available, but also because I've shifted some of the experiment down to smaller groups. I had over complexified it. I think I was trying to like track way too many things in the
Yeah.
first couple of rounds. I'm like, okay, I need to like distill this down into the basics and then
That,
bring
that's
something in.
that's always how experimental design goes. That's always how experimental design
Thank you. I feel so much better hearing that. I thought it was like, why am I overcomplicating this? So no, actually, I'm actually thinking about doing a series that is massively influenced by the experiment, and not actually connecting this series to the experiment, but sort of having maybe one of these entry level style of discussions that starts to bring in that first or second layer of complexity.
Yeah.
And then if we can sort of, if that's working really well, then bring in the added complexity. And then maybe
Right.
we'll do one where we're actually like zooming like way out and moving maybe into some idea of sort of a philosophy or like really conceptual thinking once we've sort of built up this relationship to the practice. So that's my loose plan for the next couple of weeks, is to sort of start a series of these conversations that I think will fit more into the intention of the experiment.
Well,
Yeah.
that's cool. That's cool. So yeah, there was a couple of things that came up when you were mentioning that. Um, so what um, what what do you think about this practice? Like you knew I was going to ask this. So this practice, and I don't mean just circling. I mean the whole pedagogical apprenticeship from from maybe social noting up to full blown dialogos, right? And the way it's exemplifying a way of being, not just a way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of what's behind the whole notion of authentic relating.
Really.
How is that? What's the word I want to use? What I want to say something like, what relationship does it have in affording a response to the meaning crisis?
Mm-hmm.
And what relationship does it have with affording a response to the way the COVID crisis is really exacerbating the meaning crisis?
Yeah. So
Well, you knew I was
I
going
feel,
to do this at some point.
I feel like really excited, and I'm like, oh my God, there's so many like entry points into this discussion.
Right.
What I would say, because I'm holding that developmental lens, and I just can't seem to let it go. It just seems to work so well for me, and sort of how I perceive and make sense of the world and relationships with other people. And what I really see is that, if we look at the crisis of meaning, is, I've sort of held to this frame that, we don't have this institution or this to turn around and give our power away to,
Yeah.
or to enter into community with, like that used to be the church, right, or a particular faith or religion. And as that sort of starts to die off in a sort of a post-truth world, it's
Right.
like, what is the thing that is greater than our egos, greater than
Yeah.
ourselves, that we want to give ourselves to? Like that seems to be like a biological
Yeah, mattering.
drive.
Mattering. We
Yeah.
need to
Well,
matter.
exactly. Yeah.
We
Yeah.
need to belong to something bigger than ourselves, and we need to feel like we're connected to it in a way that matters to it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, through authentic relating, the thing that matters is the quote unquote other, which is in very, very many ways also ourselves.
Right.
So I sort of hold a particular frame that, yes, God exists, but exists within here, within my perception, within my relevance realization, within my salience landscape.
Right.
Like, that's what's there. And can I transcend my ego and allow that information in to guide me? So
Right.
that's sort of my spiritual orientation, if we were to call it.
Right.
And
Right.
and I think my experience, like, I didn't have that before authentic relating. So it was through my experience in authentic relating of, I went into authentic relating as a misanthrope. I didn't like people. I really
Right.
didn't like people. Like, I blamed everybody else for everything that was wrong everywhere. And now I feel like I've got the capacity, I could love anybody. And and that came through these practices of sort of being with people in their world and noticing how I'm impacted, and then how they're impacted by my sharing of that. Like, it created something richer in my experience than I had experienced anywhere else.
Right.
So it felt like it was something much greater than me. Like, oh, there is something here that I can't create on my own. I could sit here and meditate. I'm not going to get this same
Right.
experience that I'm having in relationship with you or in relationship with a group. So that, just, the enormity of that, and then how it brought value back into my own perception of who I am and my identity, and what I was able to learn about myself just through the reflections that would come back through this. Like, to me, and it created a shared context for me and my wife. Like, it's, in so many ways, it's become my world.
Yeah.
And I had never thought about mission and purpose until about a year into doing this. There was a weekend immersion. So it's like really intense, like 2-3 days of like, just, inner work and,
Yeah.
looking in and relating. And I got so scared. I got so scared because I thought, oh, wow, for me to do this thing that I now feel called to do, it's going to like blow up my entire life. Like, my life is going to change in this moment.
So I just wanted to note, and this is not, me, this is not in any way an insult. I want to
Yeah.
note how religious your language is becoming. You're feeling called, you're connected, you're speaking of the logos that, almost like it's sacred to you, it's transformative, right? It puts you into right relationship with yourself, with other people. I mean, so I sense it, and we haven't talked too much about your past together personally, but I sense that not only did you go from being a misanthrope to being philanthropic, it sounds like you also went from kind of a secular or non-religious stance to a more spiritual or religious, in the sense of enacting religio in the way we're talking about here. Is that also something that happened?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's exactly
So
correct.
that's a way in which it is a deep response to the meaning crisis. I mean, if you'll allow me, and if you feel this is an imposition, challenge me right away. But it seems to me this is kind of like what I'm trying to talk about, of the religion that's not a religion. We are activating and enacting the logos. We're feeling called by it. We're in faith to it. We're trying to stay dynamically coupled. It's putting us into right relationship with ourselves, with being, with each other. It's leading us to aspire. It's giving us mission, all this kind of stuff. Yet you're not being bound to particular, dogma set of propositions.
Yeah.
The dogma that emerges is purely reflective, practical. It's pragmatic dogma. It's, well, what are the things that are reliably invariant that afford us getting into this flow? That seems to me, and I've noticed that's I mean, in the circling and reading about it, that this spontaneous emergence of of spiritual and religious language, that seems to be like a common feature in circling events and things. Like I've seen it in person, and I've read about it, and it just happened here between you and I when you were relating.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
I think it's fair to say that my language in general around any of these newer experiences is very limited because I really didn't have, a religious background. I really didn't
Right.
have, like, this is a whole new world, like we make a joke. It's like seeing the Matrix, right? Like
Right,
you
right,
take
right,
the
right.
red pill and now you can't unsee everything that you can now see.
Yeah, yeah.
But through that, it's like, I don't have your education and your mass vocabulary so for me, it's like, I'm picking up, this is the way in which I'm imitating, the people who taught me or who are
Yeah,
mentoring me
yeah.
in it. It's like, this is the language that they're using, and I make meaning using those words, right? So when I read like your papers, I have to translate them because I know what you're saying. Like, oh, this is this thing in my
Right,
world,
right.
or
Yeah,
in
right,
my
right.
language. It's
Right.
exactly, we're talking about the same thing, but it's just the language is different. So I think that's more, I'm not quite sure where that comes from. I don't know that I can identify that it's some part of me that wants to identify with that idea of spirituality or religion, but there is this perspective that I'm experiencing things that are bigger than myself, greater than my ego. And in that space, it seems to me most of the, set of academic circles, most of that language is religious language.
Yeah, 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 very much. You explicitly did invoke God in your description, and you
Mm-hmm.
also it's the simultaneity of being connected to something larger than yourself that calls you. You also talked that you feel called by it.
Yeah.
It's seducing you. It's drawing you forth. It's ecstatic. It's drawing you beyond yourself, right? And so there's something deeply aspirational and transformative about it too.
Totally.
And so I think that's right. I think that the way in which the practice, right, the practices exemplify a way of being is the way in which this responds to the meaning crisis. I don't think it's going to produce a set of propositions where everybody goes, "Oh yes, of course."
Right. Yeah, I agree. I don't think it will either. Yeah.
Right.
But my sense is what it is, or what it's in service of, is a transition through to the next stage of development.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for me, I see it, it's helping, hopefully helping society. Like, I'm bringing in complexity. The work that I'm doing brings in complexity to most people's lives and awareness of themselves in relationship. Like, most people don't consider construct, like they're not even remotely construct aware. Most people can't even take their own perspective. Like
Right.
they
Right.
can't even they don't even know what that is. So I'm trying, again, through the developmental theory lens, I'm trying to bring in this complexity in something that really matters to people, and that tends to be their relationships,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The studies all say, what was the most important thing before you, it was your relationships. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
it just seems to be the closest thing to objective reality we can put our finger on.
Right.
And therefore, to bring sort of this mode of development or moving through, to grease the wheels, to add the complexity, to create the what is it, one of my teachers says, change happens either through by accident or through discourse. And it's like, these practices make us more accident prone.
Yeah.
Like setting up these
Yeah.
containers, like, give us an opportunity to clash. I think you have a map that you brought, I remember, and that's sort of the thing, like it, and then you can zoom out from it and you can look at it again, and then you break the frame, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then you can zoom out and look at the frame, and so
Yeah.
to me, that's what we're doing through authentic relating, through circling.
Oh,
And
that's good.
so
Yeah. Yeah.
I see it as like in service of sort of bringing us through to the next developmental level, um, uh, and sort of pragmatically, but also in terms of meaning. It's been so deeply satisfying. Like I don't need a thing out there. It's not a car. A car doesn't make me satisfied. A new coat doesn't make me satisfied. In the way in which coming into deep connection with myself and with others, like it's
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. That's meaning in life. That's the
it's
meaning
just
in life.
exactly, yeah.
That's the meaning in life. Right.
Yeah. And then, in terms of the COVID piece, sort of the series of conversations that I want to start is, what I sense is, I've sort of been holding this question that the pandemic is creating a pregnancy of possibility.
Very
There's
much.
so much
Kairos.
potential. Yeah, kairos, exactly. Yeah, we were on that call talking about that. And for me, it's like, okay, what do we want to give birth to?
Yeah.
But I was on a call, my 5th round, and I remember somebody was sort of like, I've got like this energy, but I don't know what to do with it. They don't know how
Right.
to bring it
Exactly.
into action.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm hoping that we can have a collective intelligence conversation, and we'll find a thread of coherence, and that will build and grow into some sort of, I don't know, sub meaning or micro meaning, or is in alignment with their own individual meaning. Even if they can't identify that meaning, it'll light something up in them, the logos,
Yeah.
and then bring that into action. And I'm hoping that is what these conversations, you were talking about the campfire, right? Like
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
digital
Yeah. Yeah.
campfire. It's like, that's what I want to do. I just want to be a little bit more intentional rather than casually talking.
Yeah. Yeah. Very much. Very
Yeah.
much. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a sense in which, we're trying to sort of, what is it? Neuros raft. That you're on a raft and you're rebuilding it as you're floating on it. And I think, we're trying to, from within a culture, we're trying to rebuild it. This is it's a slogan I have about stealing the culture, right?
Right.
If we can make ways of life and ways of being with ourselves and with each other and with the world, like that, do that, what you just described, that sort of that expanding field of coherence.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think we could do what religions like Christianity and Buddhism did. They didn't go in and say, rah, rah, rah. At times they did, but mostly what they did is they went in and they gave people these new ways of talking and being and seeing and growing, right? And then what happens is and a new culture emerges from, and I think that is there's a potential for that now with the kairos we're in. One of the things you can see, and you can even ask people is what are you reflecting on now, right? That you weren't reflecting on before, right? Like what is coming to mind more? What's pressing? What's demanding? And Guy has this wonderful phrase, and I like playing with it, and riffing on it. Like, coming to terms, which has both the sense of, coming to words, articulation, but also confronting and, not trying to avoid anymore.
Yeah.
Thing. So a way I've been thinking about it, of asking people, is what's coming to terms for you right now?
Yeah, I like that.
And again, and of course this will, and so there's a sense in which because we are out of normalcy and we're not going to go back to more, even Trudeau said this is the new normal, right?
Right.
Right. Because we're out of it, I think we are now willing to reflect upon meaning and intelligibility. I get your point. Many people can't reflect on it with great expertise, and that is not a criticism of them.
Yeah.
At all, right?
At all.
And it shouldn't be taken like in any way as that. But there's at least a stance of reflection that is now, I think, becoming more pervasive, that wasn't there a couple months ago.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and not even, I think, to a certain extent, for some people, I think it was available maybe a few weeks ago, but for a lot of people, it didn't seem like it was quite available for them yet, because there was still the whole situation was so novel to them.
Yeah.
It just had them, and now as my experience is, as the novel becomes integrated, it becomes sort of your background, or it becomes, the water you're swimming in. Now you can actually afford to look at something else. Like other things become salient to you now that, you've the low grade anxiety of, what's going to happen,
Totally.
That's still there, but I mean, your new normal is now more of a normal. You're not referring to it every day as a new normal. It's just, okay, I'm not going to work today.
And I mean, and not to in any way diminish, there are people who are suffering biologically, they're suffering economically, and that is important. That is very important. It's very important. But I also think that for the people for whom the sort of the survival urgency is dropping, they're now facing, like I said, they're facing meaning disruption, normalcy disruption, and they're in a marathon now. The sprint of urgency is now giving way to the marathon of endurance. And that causes a different kind of problem formulation, a different way of relating. And I think that's what I mean, where people are coming into as a, well, who am I now? What am I supposed to do? And we've been trying to fill that with sort of entertainment, but it's not doing a very good job, right? And it's so like, well, you know, the Netflix is going to run out, and you know, all these shows that are now being done from people's homes rather than in the studios. That's sort of funny and novel for a while, but it's getting kind of stale now. What do I do? What do I do?
Into terms.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I completely agree. And, you know, I do feel privileged to be able to actually like consider this and to have these conversations.
Very much.
I'm not in survival mode. And I get that so many people are in survival mode, and I you know, I have no expectation that, you know, anybody can necessarily do that in that place. I mean, it's for a reason why we're not running training courses right now. It's just like, this is not the place for that kind of learning. This is a different kind of learning that's going to be happening here.
Yeah.
So yeah.
They say you don't preach to somebody when they need a coat.
Exactly.
Right. That's not the thing.
Yeah.
So there's one more thing I wanted to bring up, and then I'll turn it back. You can answer that, and then I'll also turn it back towards giving you a summative response to our conversation. I had a wonderful conversation with Tim Adelin and Nora Bateson, and Nora Bateson and I really clicked, and we very much want to talk again. And I bring this up because you brought up the issue about introducing complexity, and that's her thing, right? And the warm data is, you know, most of our problems are complex problems in which we are immersed. We can't sort of remove ourselves from them and get the cold hard facts. And of course, the COVID thing, right, is very much that kind of immersive complexity, right? And you need the warm data, and she talks about that, and it's very important. But she's developed, you know, a distributed cognition psychotechnology, and she and I talked about it quite at length. And I noticed that it was happening even in other meetups, like in Peter Lindbergh's STOA, because you get together as a group and then you break up into small groups and then you return. And when Guy was taking us through that, we do that. And that's part of the dictates of the medium, right? It's also part of the dictates of human conversation. But Nora's had this brilliant insight where what she does is, and for me, I don't know, I don't think she'd dislike this, and we really hit it off. So I think she'd at least find it thought-provoking. I think she's found a way of getting a virtual Socrates into this, because what she does, right, is people go into the groups, and then they stay in groups for a while, and then one person moves between the groups, and people can move between the conversations. And what happens is they come in and they introduce the other group's perspective, and that's disruptive. And then things get and then what you have is this dynamic small world networks in which all the groups are doing this distributed restructuring of each other, and then they come back into the group, and people have this. They have this much more comprehensive perspective that they're trying to bring in, and I think that's also something that we need to consider as a, you know, as one of these bridging practices that helps to get. So rather than waiting for Socrates to show up or hoping that everybody can enact Socrates, I thought that's really neat, because what's happened is you've got basically distributed Socrates, and it's happening dynamically and bottom up. And so I just wanted to hold that out to you as a really interesting, you know, and I don't mean an insult by this to you, Nora, but it's this really interesting, you know, tweaking and restructuring of this machinery that actually affords, again, another way in which we could sort of get people in transition. We can start to get them to exemplify a much more complex system. So I thought that was actually really kind of brilliant.
Yeah, no, I like it. As you were talking about it, I noticed I got, you know, pretty lit up and started smiling a lot. There's something, and I think part of that's also, you know, the motion that you're bringing to it, but it's also like, yes, you're talking about complexity. And I really enjoy that. And I also noticed, so I wasn't, as you were talking about, I wasn't even so much holding the frame of complexity. I was holding it as like a real practical exercise in sort of for the project, or for this this conversation that I'm trying to have. Like, how do you do this in a large group? How do you have a
Yeah, yeah,
large group conversation? Like, Peter and Stowe's, got like anywhere from 30 to 70 people coming on there. You can't have a conversation where everybody's voice comes into the big group with 37 people. But with 30 to 70 people, you have a lot of cognition available.
yeah,
But
exactly.
if only 5 people are talking, a lot of it gets wasted. The collective intelligence will get wasted. And it might afford some insight for those individuals, and that'd be great for them. But, as the group will end up
Yeah,
missing out on it.
yeah,
So just even that idea of like, as being like a stage to sort of like
yeah,
determine what is the thing that we're actually going to discuss, like almost canvassing the collective around a broader topic. It seems to me it will come to a more coherent and focused area
yeah,
to then, almost like, instead of us doing the move when we're in, sort of in the I we circling and then waiting for that moment to come in a small group, it's like, oh, can we bring in like a general topic, split everybody up, have everybody sort of infect one another
yeah,
with an idea to see maybe something shifts in that group, or maybe they just dismiss it, and then we come back in and see like, okay, so what's here for us now? What like, where are we now?
yeah,
And then maybe that place allows us to turn around and say, okay, this is the thing. And then, if you've got a big group, you can either have that conversation because you don't need all the voices in anymore because you have
yeah,
some coherence,
yeah,
or then you can break out and have that specific conversation.
yeah,
So I noticed I was getting really excited about that, and also I think that's a training tool for complexity.
yeah, it is. It
So
is.
I think it's also like a part warm up as well. Like that can be the warm up to turn on and
Yeah.
invite more complexity of perspective.
And it's
Yeah.
interesting because the people that are moving between the groups, and everybody will at some point, perhaps, or maybe not, they might just stay. But those people are really embodying, right? They're not only going to be bringing ideas, right? They're going to be bringing timing and pacing and perspective and a way of inhabiting your body, right? And a salience, all kinds of stuff is going to be carried between the subgroups. And they're going to start resonating with each other in this really interesting. That's what she calls it, a warm data lab, which I think is a really cool idea.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, I think what's emerging is, like I said, is this very sophisticated um, pedagogical program of practices
Mm-hmm.
with some sort of, with an apprenticeship model, with some scaled imitation going on, and where we try to get people first to really exemplify something and then get them to reflect on it, which, so these are things that are coming out. So Taylor, I wanted to give you a chance to, whatever you would like to say that's summative or on your mind as we sort of bring this to a close.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just thank you. I appreciate it. It's like this was the discussion that I think you and I were going to have anyways.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And hopefully it's valuable for others who are also playing in this field, or maybe feel inspired to play in this field too.
yeah,
Because, I think it was when David Fuller was visiting Toronto, he said something about like, we need to fail and fail faster. So I'm all for, throwing more irons into the fire and seeing what people are coming up with. And hopefully we can, this can start to come more into the field, because it was me hearing, Schmachtenberger and Wheel over here, and then you and Jordan Hall over here. And it's just like, and then I'm having my, like there was a distributive cognition happening just through
yeah,
YouTube videos.
yeah, yeah,
So it's like, oh, if we can add a little bit more into that, other people trying and experimenting with cycle technologies, you know, with sort of this intention to move towards, philosophia, to enact the logos through, through this sort of reciprocal um, engagement
yeah,
within a group or around a problem. I'm pretty excited about it. Again, I hold that frame like, and this frame primarily comes from integral theory, but it's this idea that complexity is the lubricant that helps us move through to the next stage.
yeah, yeah,
So I'm all for ways of making things more complex, but I want to try to find a way to make them accessible too. and, and then not have a practice that's only available for people who've done year of circling training and everything else. So I'm very much on board, and want to stay in dialogue with you about sort of the pedagogy of like, how do we do this, and how do we do it quickly, quickly and safely.
Yeah. It has to be quick, it has to be safe, it has to be scalable, but it also has to be rigorous. So getting all of these is the challenge we're facing.
Yeah.
Well, it's just been wonderful to see you. I haven't seen you for a while because our circles have been disrupted. So I've just enjoyed being in your presence, but this really caught fire between us too, as we were talking. So I'm deeply appreciative, and I'm sure we will do this again. So I'd like to invite you to come back. Let's go out, do some more work, and we'll come back, and let's keep the progression going.
Totally. Yeah, I love that. So great to see you. So great to talk to you. I hope it's sooner than later that we get to see each other again.
Me too. So thank you very much, Taylor.
Thanks, John. Take care.